Hey, thanks for listening to Heartland Church. It's our prayer that you're blessed by this content as you seek to grow in your relationship with Jesus. However, we don't intend for this content to take the place of your weekly worship and community in a local church. So if you need help finding a gospel-centered church in your area, please contact us online at www.connectatheartland.com.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
In case you don't know me or recognize me, maybe this is your first time here, or you've only been here 2 weeks, I guess. My name is Josh. I'm the JV team. No, I'm just kidding. I'm a, well, maybe it's true, actually. I'm, what do you call it? Church planting resident here. Resident. And keep that in mind. It's not the same as an intern, okay? Resident is like a step up, right? From the intern. But yeah, so anyways, that's who I am. Great to be here with you guys. Thank you again to those of you who knew we were coming and have welcomed us and have offered us hospitality and help with everything that it takes to move a family with a 2-year-old and a 1-year-old and a wife who is, 7 months pregnant now, something like that. I don't know. But it's a rough move, so thank you to all of you who have helped us out. But we're gonna end talking about Josh now. We're gonna talk about Jesus and the Bible and all this stuff that really matters. And I would like to start, as I usually do, we're in the book of Ruth, but I want to start with a story about Jesus. This is kind of my thing, I guess. You're probably gonna have to get used to it if you're gonna hear from me, because everything starts and ends with Jesus. I don't know if you know that. Jesus is the lens that you not only look at, but you look through, like the end of a telescope, to see clearly everything else. So I like to start and end with Jesus because Jesus can help us see clearly, or better, more clearly, what is going on in Ruth. So if you have a Bible, go ahead and turn into the book of Mark, chapter 1. And we're going to read a story that may be well known to some of you and may not be well known to others. Very, very brief, very quick. It's in Mark chapter 1, verse 40. I'm sorry, I think I forgot to make a slide for this one, so my apologies. And again, no shame if you're not familiar with the Bible and you don't know where the book of Mark is. You can use a table of contents or, look it up on Google and you'll find it. In verse 40, it says, "And a leper came to him," that is Jesus, "imploring him and kneeling, said to him, 'If you will, you can make me clean.'" I'm going to pause right there for a minute because I don't imagine many of us have met a leper recently. So let's talk about what is a leper. So a leper is a person with a terminal, contagious, highly contagious skin disease. It actually makes your skin fall off. So it disfigures you over a long period of time until it consumes your life entirely. And this was well known in the ancient world. This was a well-known phenomenon. In fact, there's a whole bunch of instructions in the Bible about how to deal with somebody who has leprosy. And that would include they had to be quarantined. They had to be removed from the community. And when it was discovered that this, in fact, was leprosy, they were left out entirely. And if they just so happened to encounter another person, they had to shout, "Unclean, unclean," and move away from that person, not go towards them. This is highly contagious. So this is the guy who comes to Jesus. Notice what he actually does. He probably hasn't, he's probably lost everything, right? He probably had dreams, family, kids, thought they'd grow up, thought you'd hug each other, whisper good night, I love you, when they go to bed, enjoy the holidays together, and they had a lot of holidays in the Jewish calendar. And instead of that, he has to be off quarantine, removed from the community, removed from his family entirely. Not to see them anymore other than somebody kind of shouting over a cliff as they lower some food to him. "Hey, how you doing?" Down there. That's it. And he comes to Jesus and he doesn't say, "Unclean, unclean," and go away. He actually comes towards Jesus. He comes up to him. He's breaking all the rules. It shows how desperate this guy was. It shows how desperate this man was. He comes to Jesus. So the question that if you were a reader of this, you'd be like, what is Jesus going to do? This guy is breaking all the rules. He's going to infect Jesus. How does Jesus respond? Verse 41, moved with pity. That's what this translation says. A lot of them will say compassion. It's the word for compassion. He, Jesus, stretched out his hand and touched him and said, I will be clean. You guys, Jesus' response, his response could have been, what are you doing? Get away from me. Get out of here. You're going to contaminate somebody. Don't you realize you're unclean? You could give this to everyone. This could spread across the whole community. It's worse than COVID-19. But he doesn't, Jesus not only doesn't reprimand him, Jesus doesn't run away either. How does Jesus respond to a desperate person who's breaking the rules, breaking the law? He has compassion. He has compassion towards him, and he touches him. When was the last time somebody touched this man? When was the last time he felt somebody's touch? How does Jesus respond when a needy person comes to him and they're willing to break the rules in order to do that? He gives them compassion and he heals them. Now, how does this connect with Ruth? Well, Ruth and Naomi are people who are in a desperate situation. And Ruth is a Moabite. And marrying a Moabite is a no-no. They're in a desperate situation. And they don't know about Jesus, right? This is before Jesus' time, and the people who wrote or read Ruth are after them, but they're also before Jesus, right? We know from chapter 4 that when this was written down, it was after Ruth because there were cultural customs that the people there were not familiar with. But either way, they didn't have Jesus, so they didn't know. What is God's response to somebody desperately coming to him but violating the law at the same time? There's a tension there. So that's where we're actually going in this text and where it's going to end. We want it to end with redemption, but it ends with almost redemption. And they're left in the tension. So that's just a preview of coming attractions here. The background, if you are new to Ruth, is that Ruth, we don't start with Ruth. We start with Naomi and her husband, whose name is Elimelech. They're in dire straits. They're in dire straits. They're in an agrarian society, which is where the way that you don't have money exchanged a whole lot. The way you survive is by growing your food, and if you can sell some for profit, then you get money on top of that. So you are subject to the vicissitudes of the weather, right? So famine comes, and they're like, how are we going to eat? Elimelech takes his family down to Moab, which is the south and west of Judah. It's a plain. It's more flat. They have better opportunity, you would think, on the horizontal plane. Right? If you take God out of the picture and say, what are my odds? You would go there. That's what Elimelech does. So he takes his family there. He has 2 sons, and they marry Moabite women, and he and both his 2 sons die, and Naomi says, okay, I've got a better shot going back home to Bethlehem. And she tells her 2 daughters-in-law, Orpah and Ruth, hey, you guys got a better shot staying here. So let's just make a clean cut and go our separate ways. But Ruth says, I've thrown my lot in with you entirely. I'm not, hedging my bets and diversifying my funds here. I'm putting all my eggs in your basket. I'm going to go where you go. Your God's going to be my God. Your people are going to be my people. So Ruth goes with her. And when they arrive, they come to Bethlehem, and people go, is that Naomi? And she goes, don't call me Naomi. Call me bitter. She's really upset. She's got a bone to pick with God. And from her perspective, she says, I went away full. I had a husband. I had sons. I had a future. And I've come back empty. I don't have that. Little does she know what God has actually filled her with. So chapter 1 ends with them arriving back in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And it just so happens, Ruth says, hey, let me go out and glean in the fields. And gleaning was the process. It was the kind of social safety net for the disadvantaged in society. They have no social security system. They don't have unemployment or anything like that. What they do have are rules for those who are able to make it to leave some of what they make, what they work for, to leave that behind for the people who don't have as much as they do. And that's what Ruth is going after. And we know from the story, she happens upon this field of a man named Boaz, who also happens to be in their family clan. And Boaz is very tender to her and very generous to her, and he gives to her an enormous amount of food. I mean, doesn't hand it to her, but he loads the dice by telling his workers, like, hey, let her glean even among the sheaves. Hey, pull some of the food out and throw it down so that she can pick it up. He loads the dice in her favor. So that brings us up to the text that we're at right now, which is in chapter 2, verse 17. So I'm going to read it all the way through, and then we'll go back and unpack it. So she, Ruth, gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. Now, an ephah, the commentaries were kind of in disagreement about this. Somewhere between 2 weeks and a month's worth of food, somewhere around there. But either way, like what they agreed upon is this is an enormous amount of food to bring in one day. It's like unprecedented that you would pull in that amount. So abundance, that idea of abundance, like the Lord is providing an abundance for them. Verse 18, and she took it up and she went into the city. She also brought out and gave her what food she had left over from being satisfied. What this is referring to, if you weren't here last week, was Boaz had actually, he had this conversation with Ruth, and Boaz is there with his workers, and they're all having lunch, and Ruth is over kind of by herself among the gleaners, and he says, no, you come into our group, and here, have some of the barbecue that we're making. And she has more than she can eat, and so he gives her a little doggy bag home to take to his mother-in-law. So that's what this is referring to. She brings out the doggy bag of her leftovers. That's free translation there. Verse 19, her mother-in-law, this is Naomi, said to her, where did you glean today? And where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. So she told her, as Ruth told her mother-in-law, Naomi, with whom she had worked, and said, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. Naomi also said to her, the man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers. And Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. Why don't I pray, and then we'll get into it. Lord Jesus, thank you for your word. Thank you that your word is true always and every day. Thank you that you have made this available to us. Now I pray, Lord, that you would open our hearts to receive it. You said your word goes forth. It's like a seed that goes out. And those whose hearts are receptive will bear fruit. We want to bear fruit, Lord. So make our hearts receptive to what you have to say. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So this ending to chapter 2 really gives us almost very little new information, right? We saw last week of Ruth's interaction with Boaz and everything that happened there. So really all that's happening is she's catching Naomi up on what we already know mostly, right? So she comes in, she's got the doggy bag, and she goes, oh, where'd you get that? We all know. She got that from Boaz, you know. Oh, who blessed you? Oh, we know that. We know that's Boaz. She says, yeah, it's Boaz. We know Boaz had told her, go stay close to my workers throughout the barley harvest. Yeah, we know that. We know that. So there's not a whole ton in here that's like brand new for us. It's how narratives work. You know something, then you find out how another character responds who didn't know that. And that's the important thing, is how is Naomi responding to Ruth's news, to what we have just witnessed. And that really is, I think, the central point here. The one thing that's news to us is that Naomi says Boaz is not just a kinsman, he's a redeemer. He is a redeemer. And so I want to take some time and just camp on this idea of what is a redeemer and why does that really matter to them? You know, we think about redemption in all sorts of ways for us, but it becomes more significant when we realize what it meant for them. So we're going to look at what it means that Boaz is a redeemer and why they need it, how it's impossible for them to generate it on their own. And we're also going to look at why that Boaz is in that hard spot of almost near impossible redemption, because Ruth is a Moabite. So that's where we're going. Now, the Lord has provided for Ruth and Naomi materially. He's provided for their need, which is awesome. That's great. That's so much better than what they had before. They came in going like, well, we don't got anything. But now they have provision, at least, of food. They're going to survive. But you and I both know that we as human beings need much more than survival. You know, you give somebody a survival bag, and it's got like toothpaste and peanut butter or something like that in it, but it doesn't have companionship or love or any of the other things that we also need to live and survive and to thrive. So what a redeemer was a person who actually is able to not only support and provide for someone's material needs, but they also restore their standing as a human being and as a member of God's people. Remember, this is God's people, and each family was allotted plots of land that they needed to steward as part of God's job. You know, God, sometimes we think of salvation as like this individual thing, like I individually come to God and then he pulls me out of hell and into heaven or something like that. When in reality, God's in the family business. He's got the family business, you know? And we all got a job in that family business. And it might not be hitting people with a lead pipe and putting them in the trunk or whatever. He's got a real job for us to do. He has a real job for them to do in tending the land. And so to be removed from all that responsibility and all that it meant to be part of God's people is to be people without an identity. So the Redeemer is there to help restore that identity, bring them dignity, honor, worth, identity as God's people, right? So I got a slide for this. One of the things that a redeemer did was he bought back people's land. He bought back their land when they sold it. Most likely, Elimelech sold his land when he went down to Moab. Got whatever he could out of it. So what happened is you could sell your land, but every 50th year, the year of Jubilee, that land was to be restored back to its original owner so that the family could continue to be faithful in their job in the Lord's family, right? So if it was the 49th year, your field was not worth very much because they knew they were just going to have to turn it over next year, right? But if it was the second year, they're going to have that field for 48 years. You might be dead before it gets there, so it's worth a lot more money. Either way, Elimelech probably had indebted himself by selling the land before they went. So here's maybe it's really important to say this. The Israelite identity was primarily made up of their God, their people, and their land. If you have your God, your family, and your land. And they had gotten their God, sort of, right? Ruth has got a bone to pick. There's tension there with her God, but God is still providing for her. The Redeemer is going to help them with the land. Leviticus 25:25 says, if your brother becomes poor and sells part of his property, then his nearest redeemer shall come and redeem what his brother has sold. It was a way of restoring honor to a family. Right? We don't know a whole lot about this we don't live in an honor-shame culture. But to suffer dishonor in your family was horrible. It's like the worst thing to do. You'd rather just be dead than do that. In honor-shame cultures, this is why suicide rates are so high in places like Japan, because they're a high honor-shame culture. And so if you dishonor your family name, the best thing to do is blow your brains out or whatever, any other way you want to do it, but just make sure that you disappear. That's the only way to restore your family's honor. So, honor-shame culture and the Redeemer is supposed to restore the land, which is part of their identity. It's part of who they are. It's part of continuing in the family business. Second thing the Redeemer was to do was to marry the widow of the deceased. This is in Deuteronomy 25:5. I believe there's a slide for this as well. If brothers dwell together and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as a wife and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out in Israel. All right, so this is the idea of maintaining a family lineage to continue the legacy of that family. Once again, redemption and restoration isn't just like, hey, food, right? I just came from Portland, which is like one of the meccas of like living on the street. And I can tell you, I sat down one time. I was volunteering and I was trying to have a conversation with a guy who wasn't really interested in having a conversation with me. Finally, he says, listen, I get what you're trying to do. You're trying to like get to know me or whatever, but I don't want that. I want to hurry up and finish my meal so I can get down to Harbor Lights and get their dinner because it closes at 9. And I was like, so you're going to have 2 dinners tonight? He's like, yeah. You can have like 9 meals a day if you time it right. So like, it's not just food, right? He's going to go out and continue to live in the street. What he needs is more than food. He needs dignity, value, worth, honor, a place, a thing to do, not just a job so he can make money and stop living on the street, but something that makes him known and a part of a community, a part of what God is doing ultimately. All right? So we know this intuitively that we need more than just a handout like Ruth and Naomi are getting. It's funny how, like, I can't even remember the movie. Probably somebody here knows this movie. I remember, I watched a long time ago. It was a movie probably from the 30s. And I don't remember the actor's name. I know his last name is Powell. Who's the famous, nobody knows. Okay. Well, anyways, it was a movie, and he plays a homeless man. But they don't call him homeless. They call him a forgotten man. You know what it is? Okay, well, the point is, they don't identify him as somebody who is homeless or houseless or living on the street. He's a forgotten man, a man without an identity, a man without a circle of sufficiency. That's what we're talking about, an orphan. That's what Ruth and Naomi are until someone redeems them, right? That's what they are. Now, sidebar. No charge for this. This isn't part of the main deal. We live in a culture that has an identity crisis. We live in a culture where we actually believe what people need is to have their immediate needs satisfied. We actually don't look for that deeper need to satisfy them. And that's why in places like Portland, like you can get 9 meals a day if you time it right because everyone has good, what do they need? Just food. Just give them food. We're suffering in an identity. I mean, one of the biggest ways to see this. I'm such a nerd. I'm so sorry. I'm such a nerd. But I read this book by a guy named Arnold Toynbee, who was a historian in like the 50s, and he wrote this massive thing. I didn't read that. Somebody narrowed it down to a single volume. That was his study of 22 civilizations that had come and gone, and only about 7 of them were still left. And he described how cultures like. The genesis of a culture, how it rises, how it declines, and how it falls. And there were seven symptoms of a culture that's in decline. And only about 3 of them he identified in the West. All of them have been rampant in our society right now for a while. And a big reason, you won't read about this in the news, right? You hear about like crime is on the rise, kids not graduating from high school or college or whatever, like all these deplorable things that happen, all these pathologies in our society. And they'll talk about poverty, we'll talk about racism, but one thing we won't talk about is that there's an identity problem. Actually, most of those problems, when they go back and do the statistics, the anthropologists will say this, but the sociologists won't. Fatherlessness is a big symptom of these problems. Over 40% of households do not have a dad now. That's all the way across the board. That's what among all races. Now, here's the interesting thing. Among all those pathologies, there's one minority group who's been persecuted that's a global minority group that is actually horrifically underrepresented in all of those statistics. You know who they are? They're the Jews. And a big reason for that is because Jews have an identity as the people of God. And the way that identity is transferred to them is the fathers stay with their kids and their fathers teach this to their children. Every father was supposed to teach their child all the stories of the Old Testament by the time they were 5. Right? So I'm not saying moms, you don't have a significant, of course you do. We get our body, we get birth through our mothers, but we get largely identity through our fathers. So I just wanted, if you're a father here, it is very, very important that you stick around and that you give your life to your kids. You tell them who they are. They are going to learn who they are by your presence or by your absence. Okay? So, we're going to end the sidebar there, and we're going to go back to Ruth. Sorry. Okay. Our culture has an identity crisis, yada, yada, yada. Next thing in the notes. Ruth and Naomi, they need a redeemer, right? They need more than just food. They need more than just a handout. They need their identity back. Here's the deal in their culture. They can't redeem themselves. They can't do that. We have this thing in our society where we don't believe that. We think that, let's say, guy living on the guy who was sleeping on my porch back in Portland, because this literally happens. Guy sleeping on my porch in Portland. He just needs to get a job. He just needs to get a job, right? Get his life on track or whatever. He can redeem himself. But that's not how it worked back then. It's not how it worked for these women. It's not how it works in other societies, especially honor-shame ones. I was in India. Jeff was also in India. So if India is a diamond, Jeff was over here on the coast. I was over here. So there's this other part of India most people don't know about. It's called the tribal region. And it's not really India. It's like East Asia, but it's technically India. Well, one of the things there is they're an honor-shame culture. And my supervisor there, this was when I was in seminary, he said, in our culture, it is the worst thing that you can do is bring shame on yourself and your family. And one thing that will bring shame on yourself and your family is asking for help. So how do we get help in our culture? And I was like, I don't know. You just never need anything? And he said, okay, come back in a week. So I thought about it and I realized, do you know how that works? You have to have people close enough to you to see your needs and then anticipate your needs and meet them before you can ask. So you'd have these interesting interactions where I'd go into somebody's house and they'd say, hey, are you hungry? I'd be like, nah, I'm all right. And then they bring out food anyway. Because what they're thinking is, you don't want to bring shame on yourself to admit that you're hungry. So I'm going to keep you from having to shame yourself by giving you food anyway. So that's more like what we're talking about. You can't redeem yourself. Somebody else has to spot it and say, you need this, I'm going to do it for you. Here's the closest thing, I think, in our society to this sort of thing. Let's just say, hypothetically, you have a teenager, graduates high school, 18, 19 years old, gets in a car wreck or something, kills somebody, locked up for 30 years. Convicted of whatever it is. So he walks out of prison. He's liberated. He's free. And he's 49 years old. And he has no job skills. He has no community or connections. He can't just get a job. He needs somebody to look at him, to see his resume that has nothing on it but felony. He needs somebody to be like, you know what? I'm going to give you a shot. I'll give you a shot. I'll swallow this for you. That's where they are. They need to be, they're in a place where redemption has to come from the outside. And likewise, by the way, that's how it is with us. Very many of us, we get the gospel skewed. It's so easy to do this because it's our natural tendency. We think that how it works is, I do enough good stuff or show enough good faith to get God to notice me. And then he'll be like, all right, I'll do it. I know what's really going on in your heart. I know that you meant well. Okay, I'll save you. When actually God goes, okay, I know what's really going on in your heart. Your intentions are far worse than you think they are. And I'm just going to save you anyway. I'm just going to redeem you anyway. That's how it really works. But that's not how we view it in our culture. You know, it's funny how, it's not really funny, it's sad. Sometimes we get aggravated in our culture, especially nowadays, with how, as you get older, the younger generations are always like, they got it all wrong, or whatever, So you have these generational battles. And so a thing going on with like the younger generation now is, once again, that whole identity crisis thing of like, hey, just you create your own identity. You can be whoever you want to be. If you're a boy and you think you're a girl, you're a girl. And then they have to get everyone to say yes, like what are your pronouns or whatever, and call you by those pronouns. And sometimes that might get on your nerves, but do you know what's really happening? What's really happening is they don't know who they are, and they're begging someone else to tell them. They're begging for their identity. Like, we think that you can just make it for yourself, but you can't. Do you realize that's like one of the most punishing things to do to a person is like, you got to make up everything yourself. And then you got to convince everybody to convince you that it's true. Because most people aren't doing the like, I'm a boy who thinks I'm a girl. That's like pretty rare. Most of us are like, I'm a good person, right? That's what we invent about ourselves. That's how we create our identities. Like, I'm a good person. I pay my taxes. I go to my work. I don't steal pens from my boss. I open the door for people sometimes. I refrain from certain language when it's most convenient. I hug my kids at night. I'm a good person. Because you can always look out and find somebody else, or just look at Hitler and be like, I'm not that, right? So I'm a good person. But the truth is, like, no, you're not. Like, and you know it too. Like, that's the thing. That's why you got to look to other people. You got to look to someone else who's worse than you, so then you feel like I'm better. Or somebody who's better than you, just be like, hey, look at me. I'm good, right? I'm good, right? That's what's going on. Like, identity has to come from the outside. We need to be redeemed, you guys. Like, even here in the church, I talk about culture or whatever, but we are disciples of this culture. Okay, so we find all kinds of ways to create our own identity, and then when we don't live up to it, we're like, better hide that, or find somebody else to affirm to us what we want to believe about ourselves. Anyway, that's another sideline. I keep on getting sidetracked. I'm sorry. I've been sick all week. Okay, last thing in here. Ruth, verse 21. And Ruth the Moabite said, I'm just going to stop right there. Ruth the Moabite. This is the 5th time in the last chapter that this has been brought up, okay? In I guess the first one is in the last verse of chapter 1. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her. Verse 2 of chapter 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi. Then down in verse 6, when Boaz is talking with his servant, the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, she is the young Moabite woman who came back from Moab. Skip down to verse 10 when Boaz is talking to Ruth. Then she, Ruth, fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner? And here we have again today the 5th one, Ruth the Moabite. You know what's going on? Like, what's going on here is, this is just like a big exclamation point, where it's saying, like, they need redemption, but redemption is apparently impossible for Ruth. Jeff has mentioned this multiple times in Deuteronomy 23:3. I think there's a slide here. Let me see. I'm going to read it either way. Deuteronomy 23:3. No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever. So, can Ruth enter the assembly of the Lord ever? There's tension there, right? There's tension. Now, let me tighten the screw just a little bit more. That was sick. I'm sorry, I have like a sick pleasure in saying that. You guys are not laughing. Now I'm really embarrassed. But here, let me tighten the screw a little bit. Back in Genesis chapter 12, I got a slide for this one too. God speaks to Abraham. He tells him this. Now the Lord said to Abraham, this is just Abram, before he's Abraham. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So will Ruth be blessed through Abraham's seed? That is the people of Israel. Oof. Do you feel the tension here? God's mission is through Abraham to bless all the families of the earth, and yet this particular grouping of families seems to be outside of that blessing. How's it going to go? How will things go for Naomi and Ruth? Well, I would absolutely love to just steal all of Jeff's thunder for the next chapter and answer that question, but I think right here we just need to kind of sit in the tension. This is one of the hard things for us to do, actually. Jeff mentioned, it was so awesome last week, how God's kindness comes when things are good and when things are not good. And when they're good, we don't feel a tension. We're like, oh yeah, well of course, like God is good because everything around me is good. But to say God is good when things around you are not good, you have to live in that tension. And we have a really hard time living in tension. And yet here we have Ruth in the last verse here. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. This is months. So Naomi says, hey, stick close to her women. Maybe Boaz will come by. We'll see what happens. Months go by. Nothing happens. That's a dramatic pause to let the tension continue. Nothing happens. We will see what happens next week. Don't worry, this story is a comedy. It's not a tragedy, but even saying that, I'm lessening the tension. I shouldn't be doing that. So, these women have no future, no identity, and no purpose without redemption coming from the outside. And they're caught in the tension of that redemption seemingly being impossible. What is God going to do? What's God going to do with them? What's God going to do with us? There's a smooth transition into us. Again, some of you might be here and you might be laboring under the illusions that I had mentioned of trying to create an identity for yourself. Some of you here might actually have grown up an orphan or without a dad, without knowing who you are. And these characters didn't know Jesus. We know more than they did because we have seen Jesus back to that story at the beginning. How does he deal with that tension? His compassionate heart just breaks right through and he touches the leper. Some of you here today, you might feel like you're a no-way person like Ruth. For whatever reason, maybe it's not in the Bible or something like that, but you feel like you've been on the outs. Maybe your whole life you feel misunderstood, like you're an outsider, like you're the Moabite. And everyone has to keep reminding you, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite, the Moabite. You know what's amazing? Is that we are all that person. We're all that person. In Ephesians chapter 2, verse 12, Paul says, remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenant of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. That's all of us. But, and that's a big but, Ephesians 2 has two of the biggest buts you will ever see. Verbal buts with one T. But now, in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. You've been brought near. You know the most famous verse a lot of people know, John 3:16, for God so loved the world, and that means you. That means every single person. He gave his only son so that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. If you're feeling like the no way person, Jesus' death on the cross is his yes way to you. That's his yes way to you. And if you're wondering about your identity, Christianity can tell you, you're a child of God. You are loved by the Father. That's who you are. And when that is the core of your identity, that will shape everything else that you do. We like to form our identity around all kinds of other things. I'll just pick on me. Riding a Harley, I used to wrestle, I'm married and I've got kids. All that stuff can just be gone. Nothing can take Jesus away. Nothing can take him away. I remember one time, I was telling my wife about this. I used to be a volunteer back in Portland at a hospital as an end-of-life volunteer when somebody's at the end of their life. And I remember one of the trainings, they had you fill out, they had these little slips of paper, and they're like, write out 5 things that are most important to you in life. Write them all out. And you hold them out like this. And then he'd come by and he'd pick one out of this person's hand and pick one out of this person's hand. And he came to me and he just took all of them. And I was like, how dare you? How dare you? Those are mine. But that's what happens. We are all going to get there. You guys know that? Whether you get hit by a gas truck on the way out here, or you live and get old, everything that you love and you find your identity in that isn't Jesus is going to be taken from you. And God says that is good. That is good. Those other things that are also good, they are a lesser good. They're still good. One of the things that Augustine says, I love this, he says, the problem isn't that we love things other than God, it's that we love them more than God. Our love for God must always outpace those other things because that then relativizes them. You can then order those things and see how important they really are when Jesus is the top love, when he's the ultimate love. So, if you're a no-way person, Jesus was, I love how Jeff mentioned this too in Hebrew, Jesus was the ultimate outsider. He went outside the camp, it says. He was crucified as an outsider. One of the amazing things about Jesus, one of the things that's so compelling about him, is he doesn't fit in any of the boxes that we have for people or anything. He doesn't fit in the God box even. He doesn't fit in the God box. He doesn't fit in the human box. He's a God human. There's never been anything like it. So he suffered and was misunderstood all the time. Jesus knows you if you feel like you're an outsider. Jesus knows you. And he died outside the camp for our redemption. Now, here's the last thing I'll say. Worship team can come up. Some of us, probably all of us, have some area of your life in which it's that 2 months where you're waiting redemption. You might have come to Jesus and you prayed a prayer or you committed your life to him or you've been following him for 20 years. But there's also certain areas of your life where either you're holding out or whatever it is, the effects of sin, where we haven't experienced the full redemption. This tension is actually where we are. We're in the tension between Jesus' first coming and his final coming. I've been thinking about this somewhat this week because I've been sick all week. I'm like, Lord, give me that body that doesn't break down. It took me 4 days before I was able to actually have a clear thought about the sermon. I'm just like, Lord, help. I can't do it. Give me my new body that won't do this. It's hard to not think clearly, and we need grace to do that. I've heard, sometimes I feel old, but I'm sure I'm not as old as many of you in this room, but I've heard the older you get, the more you're like, Lord, give me that new body. Give me that new body. This one sucks. It's not 25 anymore. What areas of your life are still in need of redemption? Do you have relationships? you have relationships that are still broken? Do you have hurts? What wounds are festering? Right now, we're going to transition into a time where we're going to sing. And you have the opportunity to come to Jesus. You might have something that's so deep and unredeemed that you think it's unredeemable and it's just not going to happen. And you've given up praying for it. You've given up on asking for whatever reason. We're going to have some people up here that you can pray with. Some of the times we stop asking because we don't want to hope. It hurts to hope and have that hope disappointed. But the Lord is a good and gracious Redeemer. And when he looks at you, he has compassion. The most common emotion shown by Jesus in the New Testament is compassion. He has compassion on you guys. So, if your life is in need of redemption in some way or another, come up and pray with somebody who's part of the prayer team. But I'm going to get out of the way now and let you guys do business with Jesus. Come to him today, all right?